So you know what loops are now, and you're probably pretty good with a while loop. Hopefully you understand that really well. But and one thing that you should know is that you can do any kind of loop with a while loop. So you probably saw the title of this and thought you were going to learn something that would give you more power, let you do more, and that's just not the case. The while loop can do everything you want it to do, everything you need it to do. The reason why we're going to learn about a for loop is because it makes things a little bit easier. So it doesn't give you any more expressibility. It just makes a few things handy. What we call this is syntactic sugar. And what that really means is that the programming language has given us something that just makes something easier for us, just makes it handy. I'm trying to think of other words to say, but that's essentially what's going on. So what is the for loop? So a for loop really is just something that it's a looping mechanism that lets you loop for a given number of times. That's usually what it is. So loop for, and I can for a given number of times. And there are a few things that we're not going to learn about today with the for loop, and I'll mention those in a second. It's just got some things that we haven't learned about yet, but you're going to learn how to use it at a basic level. So that's essentially what a for loop is. It lets you do something for a certain number of times, whereas the while loop lets you do something while a certain criteria is true. Let's see. So how can you make one? So the way that you do this is you say for first. You notice that before we had the while keyword. Here we have for. And what we're going to do is say num in the range from 0 to 10. 10. And we're going to step by 1. And I'm going to explain what this range function does in just a minute. But let's just do this, and then let's print num. So let's run this program. So that printed 0 to 9. So we didn't really have to say when to stop. You know, there was no Boolean expression in here that told us when we should be done. And that leads us into this range function. So what does the range function do? So essentially range takes a begin, an end, and a step. And what it does is it returns a list. So we could just try printing out the range from 0 to 9, stepping by 1, and let's see what it does. You can see that it printed out a list, and we know that it's a list because it's in these brackets. So it's a list from 0 to 8, and I must have said 9 instead of 10. Yeah. So what it does is it takes this begin, the end, and you notice that the end is exclusive. It's not inclusive. So when I said 10 here, it didn't include 10, it excluded 10. And that's typically how you define ranges in programming or math. Usually when you have a range, it's an exclusive range. So it begins at the begin, and then it ends just before the end here. Hope that makes sense. The step function, the step parameter, tells you how many to increment each time. So we could say we want a step of 2. We can try running that. You can see that it did 0. It jumped 2. It took a step of 2 here each time. And you notice that we don't have 10 because it's exclusive. If I would have put 11, we'd have a 10 here. So that's what the range function does. And so that kind of gives us some more insight into what this for loop is really doing. So the for loop, if we go back, it gets a list from this range function, and then what it does is it says for every item in that list, do something. And the something that we're doing is this print. So that's what I said. I mentioned that we're not going to cover everything about for loops in this because we haven't talked about lists yet. That's going to be a later lesson. So for now, you can just do this range function to get what you want. And I hope you see how this is a little bit of a different way to think about a loop. Oftentimes, if you know how many things you want to go, how many times you want to loop, a for loop is better than a while loop. So that's kind of this question here. How does it differ from the while loop? Well, really, they're both loops. The while loop can do everything that the for loop can do. In fact, if I wanted to do what we just did, I can say num equals 0 while num is less than 10, print num, and then increment num plus equals 1. So here we have our start, here we have our end, and here we have our step. So if I run that, it's the same thing. We can see the same answer as what we had up here. So we know that they are the same. So if a while loop can do everything that a for loop can do, why do we do it? And the answer is that when we know how many things that we want to do, we don't have to have this in here, and we don't have to have this in here. By simply changing that to a for and that to a range, now we've got a for loop. And I didn't put in. So I hope that makes sense. And if you're ever wondering, well, should I use a for loop or a while loop? Just think to yourself, do I know the terminating condition? Meaning, do I know when this loop is going to end? And if you know, then you probably could do it with a for loop. If you don't know, that's when you want to use a while loop. And that's why we have the for loop, is because it's a little bit more convenient. We didn't have to have this thing up here, and we didn't have to increment. It just did it all for us. So that's why we like the for loop. And you'll see later when we learn about lists that a for loop is just a lot nicer than a while loop. Right now it seems like it's nice if you know the terminating condition, but if you have a list, it's way nicer. So we'll revisit the for loop when we learn about lists, but for now I hope that makes sense. So you might be wondering, well, we had some issues with the while loop that it could go on forever. You could get into an infinite loop. And do we still have that issue with for loops? And the answer is yes, we do, but they're harder. So with this loop that we had, let me just copy that. It's a little bit hard. I mean, what we did here is we know when it's going to terminate, so it will terminate. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into lists. Let's say that I had a list here. And it has the elements 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I want to loop over all the elements in my list, and then I want to print them. But what if I did my list, and this is something we'll talk about later, but I'm going to append to the list num times 6. So what do you think is going to happen? And I better not do this in here, so let me so if we were going to run this loop, so my list equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry about that, I forgot that I don't want to do infinite loops inside of coding because it'll blow up. And then I want to do for num in my list, print num, my list, append num times 6. So we're going to run that, and you see that it's just going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. It's just a big infinite loop. What we have here is we're appending to the list that we're iterating. And I mentioned what iterating means in the document, so go ahead and check out that link. Essentially, it just means what we're looping over. So we're looping over this list, and we're adding to it. So, and if we look at what it's doing each iteration, the first iteration, before the first iteration, my list equals that. But then we get to this point where we append another number, and so then the second iteration, my list will equal this. and we look at items left to iterate over is 5. And if we look again, oops, items left will still equal 5. And it won't matter how many times I do it because I'm appending to my list every single time. So my list is never getting shorter. When we don't append, then my list still equals this, but it's kind of like we've said we're done with that one. Does that make sense? So you can still get into an infinite loop with the for loop, but it's a lot harder. So that's often a good reason to use a for loop because it has this terminating condition built in. There are only so many items in the list, and as long as you don't add to it, there will only ever be that many items in the list, and so you won't run into that problem. So again, I think we'll revisit this when we learn about loops, or sorry, when we learn about lists, because there are a lot of things that you might not notice, or as we learn about lists, this will come up again. So.